Good morning. I'm Laura Bush, and I'm delivering this week's radio address to kick off a worldwide effort to focus on the brutality against women and children in Afghanistan. Because of our recent military gains, in much of Afghanistan, women are no longer imprisoned in their homes. Yet the terrorists who helped rule that country now plot and plan in many countries, and they must be stopped. The fight against terrorism is also a fight for the rights and dignity of women.
On November 17, 2001, just over a month after the September 11th attacks on the United States, Laura Bush gave a rousing radio address denouncing the terrible acts of the Taliban and the terrorists against women. The Taliban and the terrorists of Afghanistan were known at the time to kill and disfigure women, force them to wear burqas, and deprive them of education and the joys of wearing nail polish.
Pull out women's fingernails for wearing nail polish.
I encourage you to listen to the whole address. It's only 2 agonizing minutes long. Of course, the address happened when I was still in diapers, and I would have never heard of it if it wasn't for my anthropology professor in college, who assigned us an article by anthropologist Lila Abu-Lughod, and she remembers the address vividly. In her article, she's keen to point out some generalizations that Madam Bush makes, including the subtle meshing of the Taliban and the terrorists into this one monster identity, and the less subtle contrasting of the Taliban and the terrorists with the civilized people throughout the world.
Civilized people throughout the world.
In her address, we see how Laura Bush uses the plight of the oppressed Muslim women to justify American intervention in Afghanistan, why we should go forward with the war on terror. Of course, we wouldn't want the horrifying world of the Taliban and the terrorists imposed on the rest of us, now do we? As you heard, Laura's story even has a happy ending, where after the US military invades Afghanistan, women are liberated, free to listen to music, and rejoice in their country's occupation by a foreign power. In doing so, she conflates the liberation of these women with colonialism. Now, Abu-Lughod assures us that this tactic is not new. Colonial feminism, as it's called, has been around for centuries. She talks about how the widespread publication of stories of women throwing themselves on top of their husbands' funeral pyres was used by the British to colonize South Asia, or how skits performed by school children in Algiers during the mid-1800s associated the Christian land of the colonizing power of France with freedom for women and girls, and the Muslim land of Algiers with their oppression. To save women was to bring them from the land of the rest to the West, or in the case of American colonialism and Muslim women, from Islam to America, as some writers have put it. The only problem is, there's no such place as Islam, or is there? Chapter 1, IslamLand. After her years of careful research, Abu-Lughod compiled all of her concerns about how the West conceptualizes the plight of the Muslim women in her critically acclaimed book, Do Muslim Women Need Saving? The book that gave birth to this video. In it, she mentioned the book I showed earlier, Nomad, by ex-Muslim and atheist provocateur Ayaan Hirsi Ali, whose subtitle, From Islam to America, promises to tell the tale of the author's escape from the mythical place that Abu-Lughod calls IslamLand, but instead tells the story of her bouncing all over the place, from her birthplace in Somalia, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, and Kenya, before seeking asylum in the Netherlands on false pretenses, and then eventually moving to America. So clearly she didn't come from IslamLand. It's not a place you can come from. You can't exactly point to it on a map, now can you? But why is she so insistent on supporting the myth of IslamLand, especially when she knows exactly where she's from? It probably has something to do with her catering to her right-wing audience, who uphold her as a moderate Muslim. But the other books that Abu-Lughod analyzes are written by more liberal authors, and they too seem to conceptualize this idea of IslamLand and its distinct separation from the West, albeit in a much more sneaky way. Half the Sky, Turning Oppression into Opportunity for Women Worldwide, by Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Wu Dunn, talks about the individual struggles of many mostly Muslim women out in a faraway land, and how the only solution is to help them with donations from readers like you. In the book, they talk of honor crimes, maternal mortality, disease, and lack of education, among other issues, and propose a microcredit loan system to help these issues. Loans that women can use to buy feminine hygiene products so they can go to school and work easier. It's a bit of a stretch, but what's interesting is no American or European woman's struggles appear in the book whatsoever. As Abu-Lughod notes, their laser focus on the issues overseas show that Kirstoff and Dunn see the atrocities committed against women elsewhere as if they exist in a vacuum, as if they are confined to the mythical place of IslamLand, completely isolated from the atrocities committed against women in the West. Remember that 1 in 6 women in the United States, according to the U.S. Justice Department, will face sexual assault in their lifetime. Women in a first world country still die in childbirth because doctors overlook their pain. But the authors seem more concerned about unwanted touching in the workplace and even trivial issues like underfunded girls' sports teams. As for the other book, Abu-Lughod mentions the honor code. Its author, Kouame Anthony Appiah, argues that for violence against women to end, specifically honor crime, men must learn that these crimes are shameful. Shame allegedly resulted in the end of foot binding in China and even the end of Britain's Atlantic slave trade. But most of those ideas are questionable. For instance, Abu-Lughod points to Dorothy Coe's research about how foot binding didn't really disappear in many parts of inland China until the Communist Revolution. As for the idea that shame ended the Atlantic slave trade, slavery really didn't end. It was just replaced by institutionalized racism. Despite both Appiah's The Honor Code and Kirstoff and Dunn's Half the Sky providing very clear-cut answers, the reality is the solutions to these problems are rather nebulous. But what about Ayaan Hirsi Ali's novels? What things does she point to that we must stop in order to prevent these horrible things from happening to women? Abu-Lughod has some ideas, of course, but I decided to read one of her memoirs, Infidel, for myself. And what I gleaned from my perusing of the book is that Abu-Lughod's analysis is spot on, mostly. She's right in that while it masquerades as a denunciation of Islam, the central story of Infidel is not that of a woman fighting against her religion. It's a story of a young woman jerked about from country to country, each one destabilized by colonialism. Her family life fell to shambles and she fell into the hands of abuse, not because of Islam, but because her father was in exile from the government for most of her childhood. She is never at any point forced into marriage. In fact, her relationships with her suitors are quite uneventful. But that doesn't mean she didn't face gender violence, as Abu-Lughod almost implies. I'm not happy that Abu-Lughod glosses over the fact that Hirsi Ali faced genital mutilation at the age of 5. But she doesn't seem to blame this practice on Islam, which would be a stretch considering the practice predates the religion itself. Kirstoff and Dunn and Appiah also discuss this issue, encouraging their concerned readers to help and stop these atrocities from being committed overseas. Although I am reluctant to question about Hirsi Ali's personal motives for discussing her experience with female genital mutilation, I am critical of Appiah, Kirstoff, and Dunn's concerns. They seem hyper-focused on the practice while being completely unfazed or even blind to some practices we should probably evaluate in the West. I question why girls who die of female genital mutilation overseas make headlines, while the deaths of hundreds of American and European women who die from labiaplasties and breast augmentations to conform to a certain body standard are considered to be a fact of life. Despite this oversight that they make, they have a clear conception of the cause of these atrocities, and it seems they don't give Islam the brunt of the blame. The Caged Virgin, the Honor Code, and Half the Sky make it clear that these problems reside elsewhere. I do not despise Islam. I am thoroughly conscious of the noble values that the religion promotes, such as charity, hospitality, and compassion for the weak and poor. We don't blame Allah's difficulties on the Prophet Muhammad or on Islam as such. It is widely agreed across the world of Islam that neither the Quran, nor the Sunnah, nor the Hadith endorse the killing of women by men in their own family. But you can feel what comes next after these quotes that Abu-Lughod chose. A big but. Islam is not the root of all evil, but. Then what is the issue here? Well, while Abu-Lughod asserts that the issue in their mind is the ways of IslamLand, specifically the ways of the men of IslamLand. It is the men that desire these women's genitals be cut. It is the men who kill women out of honor. And it is these horrific atrocities committed by the men of IslamLand that are embodied in the plight of the Muslim woman. But just as this idea of IslamLand's existence is questioned by Abu-Lughod, so is the idea of the monolithic Muslim woman. Situations that women face vary greatly by region and their class. Like, who is this Muslim woman we're talking about? Congresswoman Ilhan Omar? Malala Yousafzai? I'm sorry, but you get my point. Muslim women around the world are scholars, they're presidents, doctors, lawyers, etc., not just suffering people under the thumb of Muslim men. This generalization is so silly. You have to question why it exists and what it is being used to do. You also have to step outside the world of respected, critically acclaimed books and dive deep into the world of more trashy and sordid novels, the kind that a large number of people read. Chapter 2, Authorizing Moral Crusades. The image of the suffering Muslim woman has appeared more and more in what Abu-Lughod calls pulp nonfiction, a genre where the graphic and sometimes pornographic details of these women's lives fill pages and pages of these paperback books often seen in the windows of airport bookstores. All of these novels claim to be true stories, of course. That's part of their appeal. Their covers are almost ubiquitously an image of a veiled woman, with only her eyes showing, staring into your soul, crying for help. But behind the pained faces of these women on the covers, there are armies of ghostwriters and journalists who are the ones who actually write the words inside. Words that are often very loosely based on the stories of real women, some of whom are not even literate. These books capture the unfreedom of IslamLand, where women are second-class citizens, the property of their husbands, where they're abused as the result of the oppressive culture there. And the way these books capture it is through sexual means. I would like to read you a passage from one of these books that Abu-Lughod chose to embody the genre. This passage is from the book Sold by professional ghostwriter Andrew Crofts and co-authored by one of the girls who was sold in question, Zana Musin. Abu-Lughod sets the scene. The mother notices 2 of her daughters are missing. She had just chosen to be sterilized. Her husband comes home drunk, and she confronts him again about her 2 missing daughters. He tells her to forget them and locks her in the room. Miriam recounts. He was close now, leaning towards me, his beery breath engulfing me. I sat, terrified, on the sofa. He came closer and held out his hand. I slapped it away furiously, hoping he would go away. Instead, he pulled me up, his good thumb and middle finger around my throat. I fought him off, pushing him to the floor. He grabbed my dressing gown in a vain effort to save his fall, pulling the material apart, tearing it down its length. "Take your clothes off, all of them," Muthana growled deeply. Well, if he thought I was going to make this into some fantasy trip, he was mistaken. I flung my nightie into a heap on the floor contemptuously. His eyes traveled over me, settling on the scar from the operation to sterilize me. He reached out and touched the scarred flesh. Instinctively, I slapped his hand away. He laughed and touched it again. I went to slap his hand away when suddenly he grabbed my hand by the wrist and pulled me sharply to the floor, rolling me over onto my back and jumping on top of me immediately in a quick movement. I scrunched my eyes shut and clanked my fists at my side. I lay rigid on the floor as he indulged himself, crying out in his pleasure as I cried out in my shame. This scene, which is horrifying, is written like erotica, because that's what it is. Now, I don't want to judge people, and neither does Abu-Lughod, who is infinitely strong in her anthropological restraint to refrain from judgment. But these books are consumed by the millions by a predominantly female audience. And these themes of BDSM seem written with the intent to arouse. The ghostwriters know what people want. They want 50 Shades of Grey set in the exotic setting of IslamLand. But pornography isn't the only kind of story that flies off the shelves. Its popularity is only rivaled by the seductive allure of the honor crime. I would like to bring up one of the books that Abu-Lughod points to, Honor Lost by Norma Curry, which is written about the honor killing of her best friend in Jordan. Abu-Lughod characterizes the book as a classic romance novel, with an enthralling plot only interrupted by long and tedious rants about Islam, no doubt to remind the reader that the book takes place in IslamLand. After the tragic ending, the author encourages the readers to write to the UN Commission on Human Rights in order to condemn the practice of honor crime. The issue many people have with the book is that it was made up. Norma Curry, whose real name is Norma Begin-Tolopoulos, used her fabricated story to gain asylum to Australia in order to escape not the horrors of Islamland, but fraud charges in Chicago. The case was cracked by the spectacular work of Jordanian journalist Raya Husseini, who found countless errors in it. Luckily, the publisher ended up withdrawing the book entirely. But what does a work of outright fiction tell us about real honor crimes, or at least the public perception of them? Well, Abu-Lughod asserts that this fictional memoir perfectly displays the fantasies and seductions of the honor crime. She explains how it contrasts the titillating horrors committed by the other with the sexual liberation of the West. And you don't have to look too far to see narratives like this one imposed upon real-world honor crimes, or so-called honor crimes. For instance, in February of 2005, a young woman was killed in Berlin, allegedly for not wearing a veil. Of course, this was immediately branded by the media as an honor crime, but Abu-Lughod points to the anthropological work of Catherine Ewig, who has a much better explanation for the causes of her death. It was not the ancient code of the desert that resulted in her murder, but rather the gender violence and machismo that quickly developed in gangs. Gangs of immigrants that, in Europe, were formed to fight against the Islamophobia, racism, and poverty that they face. What's even more interesting is how the media dug deeper into her life, claiming she was liberated by the German nightclub scene, free to choose who to date, who to love, before her life was tragically ended. In these stories, both fictional and ones spun into narratives loosely grounded in reality, they fetishize women's freedom with great alacrity in order to sell countless copies of magazines and books. But what is this freedom that they're selling, and why does it turn people on? Chapter 3. Freedom. If you look at this photo from a German women's rights group, an interesting connection is made between oppression and the dreaded veil. The caption reads, "Oppressed women are easily overlooked. Please support us in the fight for their rights." This kind of imagery is everywhere. It gives an interesting meaning to the veil, that it removes women's agency. But this meaning is not often shared by the women who wear it. Because believe it or not, veiled Muslim women are not inanimate trash bags and have a voice and opinions. This whole video could be made just about the veil, but that's already been done. I'm just going to stick to the brief section that Abu-Lughod has in her book. That covering scene in the German poster is a burqa. A burqa fully covers the face with lace and has become one of the most controversial forms of veiling, especially considering that wearing a burqa is mandatory in many parts of the world. And laws like these were most infamously put in place by the Taliban. But what this dress means to us, an outfit of unfreedom, is not what it means to many of the women who wear it. You see, the Taliban didn't invent the burqa. It was worn by a certain respectable but not elite class of woman. It wasn't worn by every woman before the Taliban mandated that all women should wear it as a matter of it being religiously appropriate. The burqa was mostly worn by women who had strong families and whose economic circumstances meant that they didn't have to work. If you were a street vendor or a student, chances are you would be wearing a hijab. In this way, the burqa really isn't seen as a mark of women's submission to men. It's seen as a mark of a woman's social class. This is the reason why women didn't cast off their veils when the US invaded Afghanistan in the early 2000s. When women can legally wear whatever they want, they still cover, albeit with more variation in the kinds of cover they may wear. But we know that many women in these countries where the burqa is still mandated don't have the choice to not wear it. At least, that's how we think of it. This is where the idea of freedom comes into play. What does this choice mean? And how is it different from choosing to wear a suit to a fancy restaurant? A restaurant that you would get kicked out of if you wore Bermuda shorts. But we don't question dress codes here. But they seem to guide our decisions without us knowing it. Because it's almost like the choices we make aren't really our own. You may freely choose to wear a suit to that fancy restaurant, but the forces that lead you to that decision are entirely out of your control. In the same way that the region and social class that a woman is born into might affect what they wear when leaving the house. Although I am not very fond of dress codes, what is the solution to ending the barbaric practice of forced veiling? Banning the burqa, as some places in Europe have done? Aren't those laws just as oppressive and restrictive as those put in place by the Taliban? I'm not saying that women who wear the burqa in these places where it's mandated can just walk out of the house not wearing it. What I'm saying is people tend to not give things like dressing ourselves in the morning a passing thought. I don't question why it's illegal to walk around naked when I put on my clothes in the morning. I don't really question if that was a decision I really made or if it was out of my control. But of course, these dress codes, if and only if they take place in IslamLand, are seen as the root of all evil and are the purported cause of many of these honor crimes, which almost always have overarching factors beyond what the victim chose to wear that day. This discussion of choice, whether Muslim women are free or not, extends to every facet of discussing Muslim women's rights. Rights that those who are privileged and learned and come from cosmopolitan NGOs consider to be universal. Even though, as Abu-Lughod explains, universal rights like those laid out in the United Nations Declaration of Universal Human Rights that these people and these NGOs adhere to are largely a fantasy. She discusses in depth about why the idealized and governmentalized perception of women's rights does little to affect the lives of the women they purport to help. One of the main focus of these human rights discussions is this idea of forced marriage, which also comes in tandem to discussions about human trafficking. But these discussions often focus on things that don't seem very relevant to the problems at hand. Forced marriage and outright human trafficking are intimately linked with poverty. As times get tough, pressures on families come to a boiling point. Tough decisions are made, decisions that are barbaric, that seem contrary to a woman's free will. The solutions that many of these NGOs propose seem to direct the blame of these issues on some kind of ancient cultural code, and that this code is indeed the cause of these forced betrothals. Abu-Lughod talks in great detail about the real world, where even these very intricate solutions proposed by these NGOs aren't nuanced enough to capture the complexities of real women's lives. I'd like to focus on the women that she studied in Egypt through her stories of Egyptian women, women who she came to know intimately through her decades of work as an anthropologist. She demonstrates many of their lives' complexities. For instance, she showed how myriad factors resulted in one woman to stay in an abusive relationship, and how stories like hers made her very reluctant to accept the framing of these women's stories in the context of Islamic human rights, or any kind of universal rights for that matter. This woman, who she calls Khadija, is bound by a web of factors sprawling across the globe to her husband, and she's bound as well by the more tacit personal factors of attachment and dependency. Khadija was in a marriage that she was understandably unhappy with, and unhappy is an understatement. She was married to a violent husband. Her declining mental health due to this, as well as due to a history of mental health issues in her family, resulted in her frequently going to visit expensive doctors up in Cairo, which only compounded on the medical bills racked up by her declining physical health. She could never stay at the hospital for long enough to be properly treated. It was too expensive, and she had kids to care for. Not that her husband helped much with that. In this case, the oppressive force is poverty. She can't afford to escape many of the situations that put so much strain on her. This poverty, as well as resulting from her family history, can be traced to Egypt's colonial past, as well as more contemporary Egyptian history. Global pressures strain her marriage. Her husband is out and about drinking heavily and mingling with European women who offer him proposals and resulting wealth from these marriages. And of course, he eventually married one of these women and had a kid with her. And this marriage gave him power. It gave him and his kid European status, which further upset the gender balance in a context of global inequality between him and Khadija. Now you can hopefully see the tip of the iceberg here, of all the things that might push a woman into or keep her confined in a terrible relationship. But what is the solution to the story? Should we wish for Khadija a happy ending as seen in pulp nonfiction, where she flees her family, her children, her culture, in a wild escape from the perils of IslamLand and to the safety of the West, a land where she can choose who to love? In this pursuit of choice and freedom, we attempt to destroy all the things that Khadija cannot control. the things that make her who she is, the family she was born into, the specific regional circumstances of where she grew up. Abu-Lughod points to the conclusion of one of Judith Butler's many essays on consent and choice, in which Butler shows what's holding us back from destroying these things that we can't control. There are forms of proximity, of living with, of adjacency and cohabitation that are radically unchosen, and these constitute a basic form of sociality that no one enters contractually, and constitute the social conditions of life to which we never consented, and which are finally indifferent to our consent. These are conditions we are nevertheless obligated to protect and defend, even though we never agreed to them, and they do not emerge from our will. After establishing our relationship with the things out of our control that formed our lives, she clarifies what that means for our conceptualization of our lives and the lives we could have had. Those lives which exceed me and are not a matter of my choosing are a condition of who I am, and so there is no life that is exclusively my own. We are finally creatures of life, including creatures of passion, who need what we cannot fully understand or choose, and whose sexual and emotional lives are marked from the start from this being bound up with one another, with unknowing and necessity. You see, in a truly free world, we would choose to change the parts of ourselves that make us who we are. That would be the only thing that could put our lives 100% under our control. But since we can't do that, nothing about our lives is exclusively a result of our actions. Even the decisions that we do make, which are often driven by forces in our mind that we fully don't understand about ourselves, we often make these decisions without knowing the outcome of them, which further shows how little we actually control our own lives. Let's say we could uproot everything about our lives. Then what would be left wouldn't be us, now would it? In conclusion, so what does all this lofty philosophical drivel mean for Muslim women? Well, you see, this passage by Judith Butler shows us that Muslim women don't need saving. The end. I'm just kidding. According to Abu-Lughod, Butler's ideas greatly shrink the gap between the free world and the unfree Muslim women who have no ability to choose their destiny, because we don't have much choice either. It forces us to rethink these ideas of rights and whether or how we should go to war to give women these rights. The point of the book is not to tell us whether or not Muslim women need saving. That's just clickbait. The point of the book is to question the things that governments and NGOs use to authorize their moral crusades, to try and avoid the catastrophic chain of events that these interventions might cause, to recognize that these Muslim-majority areas are not separate from us, but are entangled and part of the same political and economic systems that we are in. Now, even after this very long video, I'm sure you still want to know, what can we do about the very real issues women face overseas? Because women overseas do face issues on the basis of their gender, just like women everywhere. Well, Abu-Lughod is brilliant, but not an omniscient deity. But just because she's only one person and can't give a straightforward answer doesn't mean she encourages passivity about these important issues. All she can do is tell us this on page 224. If pressed for an alternative formula, I would probably give the following advice. Look and listen carefully. Think hard about the big picture and take responsibility. I love this book, and I personally think it is amazing. Not perfect, but still an excellent read that really got me to question things that I just took for granted. And I'm glad I could share this book with you. And you should totally read it. This video is just the spark notes of her book, in the same way this book is the spark notes of decades of academic research in the field. And that's where I think I'm just going to leave this video right here. I'm glad you got all the way through the video, and I would encourage you to give it a like if you enjoyed it. Oh, and if you're rich and would like to support me, my Patreon link is in the description. If anyone signs up, I'm going to post some outtakes and stuff on there. Anyways, it's dinner time. I should probably go eat, and I hope you have a good week. Bye-bye.